Okay, I think we're about ready to get started, everybody. Sorry for the delay with the tech issues. Dr. Walker, I'm going to give you a brief intro instead of the full-length intro. You folks can read it on the website. But Dr. Walker is an award-winning instructor of First Amendment law and religious studies at Rutgers University. He teaches AI ethics and law as an honors college faculty fellow. He is also president of the 1791 Delegates, a nonprofit public charity named after the year the Bill of Rights was ratified. So he has a lot to say about our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the separation of church and state issues. And I'll leave it at that and let you get started.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Dr. Birch and to everyone at the Center for making this possible. Your hospitality is top-notch, golden. Thank you so much. Yesterday, we had a brief workshop to explore some constitutional principles that I will use as the basis for my conversation about how we have become a nation of religious minorities. So I'm going to give you a rapid response overview of some of the top level information from that workshop yesterday to kind of feed into what we're doing today. The first is that we're applying a religious studies premise to our research here. One, we're recognizing that religions are internally diverse, that they evolve and change over time. They're embedded in all aspects of culture, that people form and reform their religious identities based on different characteristics, such as how much they hold of a value for their beliefs, which may, in the blue circle, be very strong for someone, but beliefs might be quite small for another person because their sense of behavior, their spiritual practices, their ritual, their attendance with a specific community might be stronger than any particular alignment with any kind of particular theological views the community might hold. Or someone might have a stronger sense of belonging to a community, a tradition, but not necessarily have strong sets of behaviors, haven't been to the community for a while, but still identify as such. And what we've recognized is that people form and reform these beliefs, behaviors, and belongings throughout their lifetime. So individuals are dynamic and change over time. So a person's composition of these three Bs might be different when they are just out of college than after when they have their first child, when they lose a spouse, for instance. In each of these stages of life, these are dynamic. So with that said, the overview of our workshop yesterday focused in on some headline elements of what we can learn from colonizing America, the colonization period, to constituting America, expanding westward to America, reconstructing after the Civil War, incorporating the federal Constitution to state laws, and then what we have seen in our lifetimes, the diversification of America. And I argue that in 2025, with this new administration, we are seeing a dramatic new start to an unnamed new America, which we will conjecture on what that might be. So starting with colonization, what we have seen is that there were many different types of Christianities that were bartering over how to establish different dominions in some cases, and in other cases, no religious dominion at all. So, for instance, Rhode Island and Delaware and Pennsylvania were all free colonies, and that they did not establish a state religion. We have other colonies that started with something. For instance, Georgia did not have an established religion, but then later went to Church of England. We've seen some other changes in religious establishments like New Jersey, New York, and Maryland, for instance, where they started with one form of established to another. I bring this up because there are so many different Christianities at play in colonial America. You had to ask yourself, whose God rules in any of these particular areas? Take, for instance, Virginia. This was very different than Puritan Massachusetts. In Virginia, they were actually banning Puritans from entering the colony, and Quakers, and at times Catholics. And in colonial Virginia, you saw an entire set of what they call bloody code laws, where if you were disrespecting clergy, you were openly whipped. If there was a failure to attend church, you would be whipped and been put into the galleys for 6 months. If you broke the Sabbath the first and second time, you would be whipped. If the third offense, that would result in death penalty. If you spoke impiously of the Trinity or violated temperance laws, all of these things started to result in high levels of government regulation of religion. This ultimately led to religion's demise in Virginia. And why is this significant? Not only because colonial Virginia had so much land all the way up through Wisconsin and Minnesota and so on, but because some of the main framers of the US Constitution were from Virginia. And so what we have seen is that many of the founders that were saying, let's not establish a colonial religion in Rhode Island, in Pennsylvania, and Delaware, and others, and at Georgia at first, they were arguing a biblical basis for separation, which is very much lost in an anti-establishment position that you see in the political rhetoric today. There's a false narrative that somehow separating government and religion is a secular, anti-religious point of view, when in fact it is biblical, drawing upon Hebrew scriptures and passages from the New Testament, such as render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's. These types of passages have all argued for a distinct type of separation, which was persuasive to many of the framers who, when building Virginia's Declaration of Rights and seeking to disestablish its religion from the Anglican Church, which had completely led to the demise of religion in that culture. Meanwhile, religion was quite flourishing in Pennsylvania, where the founders were meeting to write the Constitution. Religion was flourishing in Rhode Island in really interesting ways, and they saw that it was self-evident that if you establish one religion, soon enough there will be some power broker who will then change the established religion, which we saw in Old World Europe and in England in particular. And so what we're seeking to uncover at this moment is that the Declaration of Independence was seeking to form a new world order that said that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator by inalienable rights. The irony, of course, is 72% of the signers were also slave owners. At this same period, in 1776, the Congress of the Confederation adopted the national motto, E pluralis unum, out of many one. So this idea of many different Christianities and colonies with no established religion were all coming together to form a new nation. This in turn led to a constitution in 1789 that only had one mention of religion, which is that there was no religious test for office. Mind you, there were no Bill of Rights in this initial constitution. In this same period, George Washington signed into law the first law that defined a U.S. citizen as being any alien who was a free or white person. Why is this significant to religion today? Because what we're about to see is that the word white was not removed from U.S. law until 1954, the same year of Brown versus Board of Ed. It wasn't in place, it wasn't actually allowed to be implemented until 1968, when the immigration laws changed dramatically. So what we are seeing at this very moment is when we say free and white person can be a citizen, that determines which of the world's religions have access to this new nation. In this context, what we see is that the First Amendment is introduced along with the other amendments making up the Bill of Rights, saying Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, also enumerating other fundamental rights. What's fascinating to me about this moment is that already 9 of the 14 states at that moment had already disestablished its religion. So there's a false narrative to say that there's somehow a federal imposition to make establishment on all the rest of the country, when in fact, this was a local initiative where they took 200 years of colonial law to understand that this could actually lead to peaceful coexistence. And so what you'll see is soon after the First Amendment was ratified, the other 4 states followed, and they too disestablished their own religions. The second president of the United States signed the Treaty of Tripoli, saying that the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. And specifically, this was done with a Muslim majority country at the time, Tripoli, which we now know as Libya in North Africa. The next president, the third president of the United States, Jefferson, spoke about this wall of separation between church and state, echoing the language of Roger Williams in colonial Rhode Island, who talked about separating this wall of the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. Now, as we go westward into the expansion of America and the extermination even further of indigenous peoples, we see that there becomes this rise in Christian nationalism rhetoric, specifically out of the landmark case Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823, where the Supreme Court articulated the right for white, free men to discover land that would then be used for a Christian purpose. This led to the Indian Removal Act, where President Jackson and other presidents started to displace Native Americans, which led to 50 to 80,000 indigenous people being removed, displaced, opening up 25 million acres of new land to white settlement, cotton production, and more slavery. This led to the Trail of Tears, which exterminated a quarter of the Cherokee tribe, and then the others that remained either were displaced as adults or separated by the children. In this period, we see after the Civil War a reconstruction of the Constitution, giving us the 13th Amendment banning slavery and the 14th Amendment saying that every person under every state has due process of law and equal protection under the law. All of these new constitutional protections still didn't protect indigenous people, no matter the First Amendment right to free exercise of religion or the equal protection under law, as we see in the Indian Assimilation Plan that President Grant enacted after the Civil War, where he used federal funds to hire Christian missionaries to engage in the education of Indians. And this was intended, as one military leader said, we must kill the Indian in him and save the man. The federal Indian boarding schools by 1877 had nearly 3,600 children in them, and yet by the turn of the century, it had grown to nearly 22,000. The enculturation of the children started with removing their hair, changing their names to European names, forcing them to speak English only, dressing them in European dress, and then forcibly converting them into Christianity. It seems quite odd that a nation founded where Congress shall make no law respecting and establish a religion would use federal funds to do such religious conversions. And so here we are in these many contradictory moments of a kind of Christian nationalism elements within our history that, to the plain text of the Constitution and to the history of the Constitution, completely violate these moments. In total, when Christopher Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, 10 million indigenous people lived in the continent of what is now the United States, and by the turn of the century, there were less than 300,000. This immigration framework of white and free was dismantled in part by the Civil War, which gave us the prohibition against slavery, and therefore free was removed from the immigration laws, but white remained. For instance, two Supreme Court cases tell us the story. Japanese immigrant Takawa Ozawa was denied citizenship grounds that Japanese were not considered white. They were referring to the science behind how Mongoloids were not the same as Caucasians. And therefore, even though he was a Christian, even though he was an English teacher and was raising his kids in this Christian culture, they did not deem him as white and therefore not eligible for citizenship. A few months later, Bhagat Singh Thind returned from having served in the World War I and saying that he was denied citizenship because they deemed that he was not white. The Supreme Court said yes to a common man. You clearly don't seem white. And he said, but I am from the Caucasus of India. I became a U.S. citizen by joining the military, and I served our country in war for 4 years. I have proven my loyalty to this country. And what you don't recognize is that I was from the Caucasus of India, which shows that we have a common ancestry. And the court responded, well, science might say that. However, you don't look white to the common man, therefore we revoke your citizenship. Whiteness was a prerequisite for religious freedom. I'm going to pause there. The racial prerequisite for citizenship determined who got religious freedom, not indigenous, not even a Christian Japanese person, not even a Sikh from Sikhism from India. So when you create a nation that defines citizenship by race, you immediately discredit any other non-white religion. Now, as we move into the incorporating period of America in the early 20th century, we see that the Supreme Court used the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, and Due Process Clause to say that the freedom of speech right applies to state laws in 1925. Same with press and assembly and free exercise of religion and no establishment of religion. And so all of a sudden there's this incorporating and in this post-Civil War society to say we are one nation of one laws under one constitution. Yes, we still have state rights in these key ways, but states can't violate these fundamental freedoms as it has in the past. In 1954, like I mentioned earlier, they removed white from the immigration law, the same year of Brown versus Board of Ed of desegregating public schools. And then we get the Immigration Nationality Act, which President Kennedy introduced. And then after his assassination, it took Johnson in order to bring into law, which went into effect in 1968. The point of this, we can understand the racial history of religious freedom to help us understand the basis for white Christian nationalism today. Make America Great Again means let's return to a pre-1954 rule and let's explore these ways to have the Christendom be the basis for law, which is quite odd for me, having been to seminary and served congregations for 15 years. It seemed quite odd for me to having learned about the First Amendment and learn about the biblical justifications for separation and the religious freedom that it brought and how separation actually led to the flourishing of religion as compared to theocratic law led to the demise of religion, the strangling of religion. So if you think about it, baby boomers were the first generation in American history to live in America where race was not a prerequisite for citizenship. This led to the diversification of America in many ways. We see all kinds of new cultures, new religions flourishing in America. We see a really fascinating new exchange of many different types of ethnic Christianities being able to flourish in the United States in the latter 20th century. And yet, what we have found is that they did not always fare well in the courts. If you were mainline Protestant, you were involved in approximately 4% of the cases before the courts from this period of the 1940s until 2004. And yet the court ruled in favor of your cases 70% of the time. Conversely, cases brought forth by Native Americans, Jews, and Catholics, who accounted 20% of the free exercise cases, the courts ruled in their favor around 40 to 47% of the time. Now, let's take a look at how Muslims fared in the courts during this same period. Muslims today make up 1% of the population. At the founding period, Muslims made up 5% of the population. There has never been an America without Muslims. We have seen time and time again through the history of our Constitution, through our laws like the Treaty of Tripoli, like the words and the deeds of the first presidents, that they actively included Muslims in the vision for religious freedom in America. And yet, in the courts, even though they make up less than 1% of the population and filed 7% of the free exercise cases, they only won a third of their cases. Even at the highest court, no Native American, Jew, or Sikh has ever won a free exercise claim before the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, who needs therapy? I will now transition to this next thesis, which is that we are becoming a nation of religious minorities. And why is that the greatest threat to white Christian nationalism? When I was born, Christians represented 90% of the population in the United States. Today, they represent 62%. Something astonishing happened in 2012 when Protestants, for the first time in American history, had become a minority. Now, this year, they've declined from the 48% of the minority status to 40%, further making a historic moment in which no single religious subgroup constitute a majority. Yet still, Christians collectively make up around the 60% of Americans today. However, the highly polarized nature of the social issues like women's rights, race and immigration, environment, LGBTQ rights, it has driven so many people in Christianity in particular to disaffiliate from their religion. Meaning there is a rise of what we're calling the nones, the people who check the box that say none of the above. It's actually the politics in this period that becomes highly, highly pervasive, which lead people to justify why they want to disaffiliate. Go back to the three B's. If you ask the people who identify as non-religious, are you still a theist? 90% say yes. So it's not the belief part of their theology that is fully quaking always, and yet it is that sense of belonging. Like, I don't belong in that kind of political rhetoric kind of environment. I'm not that type of fill in the blank Christian or Jew or Muslim. And so it is by the very nature of the diversity within Christianities that we see many, many interesting things happening. One, we see that there are some really strong divides between our cultures that we have to examine. To examine that, I turn to a kind of pastoral care approach to religious liberty. As a congregational minister for many years, I've officiated 200 weddings. It's been such an honor to be a part of all kinds of rites and rituals from womb to tomb. And one of the psychological studies that we were trained to do in doing family counseling was recognizing when there is marital contempt. I'm going to use this as an analogy to make the case for how there could be some political contempt that we can look out for in our political rhetoric. Professor John Gottman says that after conducting a half-hour interview with a couple, he can predict with 90% accuracy whether or not they will stay married. Over 3 decades, Gottman's lab interviewed thousands of couples in a series of longitudinal studies designed to examine a single attitudinal trait, whether one partner had contempt for the other. He concluded that contempt is the single greatest predictor of divorce. In the interviews, his research team looked for specific behavioral indicators of contempt: cynicism, sneering, name-calling, hostile humor, treating the other with disrespect, mimicking, mocking, biting sarcasm, ridicule, or other kinds of body language like eye rolling. These behaviors indicate something striking. The target of contempt is made to feel worthless. Gottman concluded that if relationships are to survive, contempt ought to be banned from marital interactions. I would like, because I'm such an optimist, Julie, that I would like to explore how we might ban contempt from our political system and move to another form of relating to one another. If contempt is an almost infallible gauge of the health of marriage, could not the measurement of contempt in politics serve as a good gauge of health for democracy? Could it be that high levels of contempt in our current political system is an indicator that our partners in our democracy are going through a divorce? So I've learned that the political and legal treatment of religion is a particularly good case study to get at these questions. Now, what are they? We are living in an age where totalitarian rhetoric and behavior is very pervasive in political discourse, as my colleagues so artfully unveiled. There's alarming amount of evidence of rise in religious animosity for the other, the suspect minority of the day. At the same time, we're experiencing a startling rise in religious-based hate crimes and social hostilities. And as my colleagues have previously revealed, these trends correlate with an alarming rebirth and then even a birth of new forms of Christian nationalism. Now, to understand these trends, we must first understand the intersection of religious and political identities. Studies show that adults often choose their political parties before claiming a religion. Politics first, religion second. This is why in many cases your religious or non-religious religious identity can correlate with your political affiliation. Now, this isn't always the case. Catholics in the United States are very politically diverse as well as racially diverse, and other traditions are also divided, and you can get in essence 2 different types of religions. Take for instance the religious affiliation of Hillary Clinton. She is a Methodist. So is Jeff Sessions, President Trump's first attorney general in his first term in office, who used the Bible to justify separating children at the U.S.-Mexico border. Using those biblical justifications for the contempt of the migrant, of the parent, saying the parents are to blame and we must separate the children, was a radical theological claim that others in the Methodist Church completely rejected, which led to the proposal that he actually be dismembered from the church. But meanwhile, what we're seeing in the Methodist Church, which has been the second largest denomination in the country in the last several decades, is that it is split in half. Over what question? Over the question of ordaining LGBT clergy and officiating same-sex marriages. This has been a trend of many different Protestant denominations where there's fissures over these social issues on the ordination of women, for instance. Now, this has led over 1,000 churches to leave the Methodist denomination, which is one of the reasons why you're seeing like this decline in Protestant Christianity and this reforming and reforming. The other way to understand the intersection of religion and politics is to consider the image before you, which is that some religious people often have more in common with someone of a different religion in the same political spectrum than with people who hold different political views but claim the same religion. Meaning, a liberal Jew often has more in common with a liberal Christian than they have with an Orthodox Jew. Members of a Black Baptist church often have more in common with Black Muslims and with white Congregationalists than they would have with conservative members of the Southern Baptist Church. Put simply, religious people can find it foreign and even alarming when people within their own parent religious tradition express opposing political views. So, what I want to introduce is the theory of political tolerance that I think is missing in our discourse, that I think if we can reclaim it, can make America great. Specifically, the commitment to political tolerance says that there is a shared set of rules that apply equally to everyone. During periods of intense ideological conflict, we can use political tolerance to recognize the inherent inalienable rights of one another. It ensures that no group is singled out for arbitrary persecution and serves as a cornerstone of democratic stability, independent of a nation's socioeconomic development. Yet history shows that political tolerance can be remarkably fragile. Consider the Red Scare of the late 1940s and 1950s. During that era, only 2% of people believed that those perceived as communist deserved full constitutional protections. If I can get you to fear somebody, then you need me to protect you from that fear. It is a perfect political playbook that is played out throughout history with the suspect minority of the day changing. At times, it was Catholics. At times, it was Quakers. At times, it was Irish Catholics, but not Italian Catholics. At times, it was communists or atheists. At times, it was Muslims. And so we have to ask ourselves, do we have the legal literacy to understand the constitutional protections afforded to everybody? Do we have the moral commitment to ensure that there is political tolerance for one another, recognizing one another's rights? And yet, at the same time, are we able to be religiously literate about these complex dynamics that form and reform our identities and our societies? So, to measure this work, I have developed a religious contempt scale to help us understand the nature of how to measure where we are as a society. Societies that receive an A protect, and you're all such good students, so I had to use a grading model here. Societies that receive an A protect the free exercise of religion for everyone, including those with no religious affiliation. Their laws and political structures actively uphold freedom of religion or belief as a fundamental human right, without privileging any single religion. These societies have low levels of legal restrictions on religion, correlating with low levels of social hostilities and violence. This part of the diagram is based on some research by Dr. Brian Grimm out of the Pew Research Center when he introduced this model. Societies that are merely tolerate one another are given a B-. They show some increasing government regulation of religion and rising social hostilities, which are indicators that we need to improve our ability to to be more politically tolerant, and not just tolerant of one another, but actively protecting the rights of those with whom we disagree in order to get the A. A government regulation and social hostilities intensify, then societies become more religiously intolerant, which warrants the C minus, which is a warning sign that immediate efforts are needed to prevent further deterioration. Societies that receive a D, dangerous, which I argue is the state we are in now, escalate from intolerance to a more extreme form of politics, contempt. This is evidence when government leaders assert superiority over their own group and systematically direct their animosity toward those religions deemed to be inferior or suspect. These expressions of superiority, of contempt, which we saw with the various laws regarding indigenous people and what we saw with non-white citizens, were deemed inferior and suspect, and therefore there was political and legal justification to restrict those religions, to restrict those rights, and in turn, this correlated with high levels of social hostilities and violence. Finally, societies that receive an F descend into religious-based violence, war, or even genocide. When my colleague Lyle Sung and I went to the United Nations to present our research to the UN Convention on AI and Human Rights, we drew upon some of his research where he worked with the UN and post-Rwanda on understanding what were the indicators of a genocide, what were the indicators, and he often talked about political rhetoric as being one of those elements. So what we ultimately need to be listening for in our political discourse today is rhetoric of the othering. Robert Schreider talks about 7 ways that we can listen for othering rhetoric. We can demonize the other, treating the other as someone to be feared and eliminated if possible. We can, on the other hand, romanticize the other, treating the other as far superior to ourselves. We can colonize the other, treating the other as inferior, worthy of pity or contempt. We can generalize the other, treating the other as non-individual and thus bereft of personal identity. We can trivialize the other by ignoring what makes the other disturbingly different. We can homogenize the other by claiming that there is no difference. We can vaporize the other by refusing to acknowledge the presence of the other at all. Right now, we have been moving from a state of political intolerance to a highly inflamed culture of contempt. This extreme sense of polarization that we're experiencing includes this political rhetoric, this increase of religious animosity in law, contempt for constitutional law and norms, with this correlated trend in increasing in social hostilities and violence. Now, I want to offer a few solutions in conclusion to help us imagine how we can recover from these setbacks. We're all pandemic people. We know how to recover from a global pandemic. So how can we recover from another type of crisis, a political crisis of contempt? We can start by considering the 3 R's of religious liberty. This is the basis of the organization of the Utah 3 R's Project, and Alicia Tucker, the executive director, is here, and I encourage you to speak with her about the Utah 3 R's initiative that's taking place in the state. What are the 3 R's? They were born out of the Williamsburg Charter, where dignitaries from all around the country in the 1980s were coming together to articulate a way to chart a new way of engaging in the diversity of America. 1, recognizing that everybody has rights. 2, everyone has the responsibility to protect those rights of others. And 3, to do so respectfully. Now, I had the opportunity to develop a curriculum for 5th graders who were a part of the Cub Scouts. And it was a really, really fun exercise to see these kids try to earn their 3 R's badge because they were going into their public schools to stop religious based bullying. They would come to their teacher and say, "Hi, I'm a 3 R's ambassador, and I'm here to protect rights and have the responsibility to protect the rights of others and do so respectfully." And the teacher's like, "Okay, 8-year-old, you go with your bad self." And in that moment, the student starts to change the culture in the classroom to say religious-based bullying is wrong. And I'm going to be a champion of the 3 R's in this classroom. And by notifying the teacher, they put the teacher on notice as well. And why is this significant? Because in the political rhetoric around anti-Sharia, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab sentiments, the travel ban, we saw a startling rise in the hate crimes toward those perceived to be Arab, including the rise in hate crimes between Jews and Sikhs and other racial minorities. For instance, in the if you take a look at the hate crime data from the FBI and you map it onto the counties, you can see a correlated effect of when Donald Trump was in certain counties doing political rallies talking about the anti-Muslim sentiments, that within 30 days, there was a correlated increase in hate crimes toward those suspect minorities. Now, it wasn't causal, but there was a correlated effect. And also a correlated effect was the increased rise in religious-based bullying in schools. Nearly half of Muslim families were reporting that their children were being bullied in public schools. And 1 in 5 of their bullies were who? The teachers, public officials, teaching 8-year-olds, ripping off girls' hijabs and saying, "Don't you look pretty?" And then putting it up on TikTok and bragging about it because they have the social cues, the political cues to say this rhetoric is okay, this behavior is okay. When in fact, it is not only a deep violation of this incredible commitment to religious liberty that we have in our country's history, but it is a violation of that child's dignity. It is beyond a kind of intolerance toward another. It's singling out a child at the border in the classroom for some kind of social hostility and even violence. To counter this, we can claim and reclaim a commitment to rights, responsibility, and respect. We can recognize that we have to be religiously literate in order to advance this cause, recognizing that religions are internally diverse, evolve and change over time, and embedded in aspects of all country. We have to be legally literate in order to ground ourselves in the knowledge and the history of the inalienable rights afforded to every person without exception. And to do this, we must simply count to 5. The person who identifies as a 1 has a dramatically different worldview than a person who identifies as a 5. They don't understand each other. They don't have the same rhetoric. They don't have the same assumptions. They don't have the same core values. They see each other as foreign, as odd, as people to be feared and eliminated sometimes. In this highly polarized society, we are seeing that the 2s and 4s are joining with the 1s and 5s, and the 3s are lost and they don't know where to go. I reject that premise of how polarization works. I actually think it's more dynamic than that. A person who is a 2 still knows the language of a 4, and they can really, really lean in and talk and have those difficult conversations to one another. A 3 can actually talk to a 5 because they know that language. A 3 can also talk to a 1. I believe we are in a moment in American history where we have gone from colonizing to constituting to reconstructing an America, to expanding it through all types of, bloody history and all types of promise across all that peril, only to find ourselves in this new incorporated constitutional framework with a highly diverse America, of this emerging nation of religious minorities. And what is required of a nation of religious minorities is that we make a commitment to be religiously literate. We make a commitment to be legally literate, to engage in civil dialogue with one another, protect one another's rights, responsibility, respect, for the 2s, the 3s, the 4s, to have a conversation with one another, to say that we are better than the most extreme parts of our society. We can develop a moral imagination for one another, an ethical empathy for deeply situating this moral dilemma that we're facing as a country and seeing one another's point of view. Understanding one another's point of view does not imply agreement. It implies an ethical commitment to lean into another person's story, into another person's humanity. And in doing so, you build not just a coalition, not just community, but a deep sense of belonging. And that's what it means to self-govern a nation of religious minorities. Thank you.
Wow. Well, can you hear me? Yeah. So thank you, Nathan. We do have a panel. The panel is going to come up here, our presenters, and we can ask them questions. On your way to thinking of those questions, why don't you help yourselves to pizza? We have pizza available here. And let us one more time thank Dr. Walker here for his comments. I was especially moved by his by his thoughts on how we can be more than just tolerant of one another, but respectful and share communal values. Right? Thank you so much.